the world is going to give you is data. And so for whatever volume index that you're using to measure your output, you're going to end up with a series of dots. And that means in order to figure out what your cost functions are going to be, you're going to have to provide yourself with a statistical measure to get there. And what I'm going to be measuring right here is going to be your average total cost. So it's the last function that we're dealing with, shapes that cost can take on. Anyway, the world will go ahead and give you data, which means that in order to analyze this, you're going to need some fairly high-level statistics. Now, I know enough of you have taken some statistical classes that you've seen some regression analysis. There's regression analysis on this, but for the most part, you have to be more sophisticated than what you've had in your classes. Commonly, you want to use something that's referred to regression, with the assumption that costs are not always as low as they can possibly be. You're making the assumption that whenever anyone makes a mistake, it's always going to be a mistake that's going to increase costs in some way. And so what you're looking at here is not trying to put a line through the massive dots that's right here, but you're trying to put a little line that's under most of the massive dots. So instead of your common regression having as your error term at the end something that's symmetric, where it's equally likely to be positive as negative, but doing something which is more likely to be positive than negative, making it show through that your mistakes are always going to be things that are going to cost you a little bit more. So, given that you should be a little bit afraid about doing the high-level stats, here's where you get to remember that rule. Don't try to do it yourself. Hire somebody else to do it, and it ends up being a little bit cheaper in the long run. So let's get you to a couple of the characteristics that you'll find of your average cost functions out in the wild. The first one is you will usually see some kind of range where the average cost function is going to decline. And so this is typically because there's a bunch of fixed costs that you're slowly weathering away, making the average fixed cost is lower and lower and lower and lower and lower, but it will reach some kind of minimum. Now after that, you tend to see a kind of scallop shape that comes through on the bottom. That's scallop or scallop. I'm talking about the little bivalves that are kind of tasty to eat. The scallop shapes take place because there's a certain lumpiness to the inputs you're adding to the production function. So it could be you're adding a shift and then adding another shift. You don't add a fraction of a shift, you add a whole shift. It could be that you're adding a piece of machinery, it could be you're adding a production line, but you're adding these things in eaches. You can't go ahead and add 3.78 of a car. You add a single car that's there. And so the scallop shape tends to evolve because of the lumpiness of the things that you're using to produce your output. Now, I've drawn this right here as if the average cost doesn't vary too much after you've gone through this period where you have worn away all those fixed costs that are there. Referred to as firms that have constant marginal cost. Or you may think of them as constant cost industries. So there are things where if you have an observation of what it costs on average to produce a unit of the good at a relatively small scale, you can say it's relatively high scale. Plenty of industries go ahead and work this way. There are things where it's easy to replicate, or you're just going ahead and taking what you've done before and duplicating again. So craft work type industries work relatively well on this. You can actually get this to go for some construction type elements. And so roofers, the cost of providing a roof is the same whether you're doing 10 roofs or 5 roofs or 100 roofs. It's just approximately the same because the equipment you can use is going to be just about the same after you get past a certain scale. Now the other alternatives you have available to you are things that have your average costs increasing as your volume increases, which are known as increasing cost industries. And those that have your average cost continuing to decrease as the volume index increases. And you can guess these are these decreasing cost industries. Now, with the increasing cost industries, typically this doesn't mean that they're doing just a worse and worse and worse and worse job. It just means that as you get larger, it becomes harder and harder and harder to coordinate all the factors that are flying around. Typical examples of this would be anytime you're dealing with wild coordination problems. I think the best example I have is concrete delivery, because you do have to coordinate an awful lot of mixing along with your orders, getting things on time during certain time frames. And that's relatively hard to do after you pass a certain more expensive. Worse than trying to schedule taxis or something along those lines. Decreasing cost industries are things where you can actually use different kinds of techniques as you get larger in order to make things more and more and more efficient. An example of this has to do with basic things, as simple as cutting cheese. In your own house, you know that if you get yourself a block of cheese, you can get a cutting board, you get a knife, you can slice it up. It's a relatively easy thing to do. But if you've ever been to, say, the Toledo cheese factory, you know that there's special equipment as you watch the line to turn the cheese 45 degrees, another one to slice it, another one to weigh out the proper portions, another way of grabbing all the things which are spare that are there in the stack. So there's a lot more tools that are available to you as you increase in scale that make it cheaper per ounce of cheese. And so again, the assumption is going to be that we're making some wild assumptions about costs and making our math easier. Real life has costs which are much different shape than we're going to be assuming here. In order to actually get at these shapes, to figure out what's going on, you in general will need to handle and hire a statistician to help you out. And so that's the last little warning about the difference between our theoretical assumptions and what we're actually going to find out in the wild. So here's another brief. Blah, blah, blah.